This episode of the Quantum Space Innovating Trust podcast is brought to you in association with Vibu Systems, pioneers in software protection, licensing, and long-term digital trust. Quantum computing is no longer theoretical, and it poses a fundamental challenge to today's cryptography. Methods like RSA and ECC will not survive the quantum era. With its next code meter generation, Vibu Systems is already preparing a smooth, compatible transition to post-quantum ready security across hardware, software, and cloud licensing. Discover how CodeMeter is being engineered for the post-quantum future and why preparing early is the only safe strategy. Visit vibu.com/PQC today.
So, Europe keeps announcing digital regulation. And every time one appears, the reaction is identical. Another act, another framework, another compliance spreadsheet. The AI Act, EIDAS 2, Data Act, NIS 2. At some point, you stop even reading the headlines properly because you assume you already know what it is. More rules around technology. But we've had this feeling for a while that we're looking at them the wrong way. Not individually, but structurally. Because taken separately, they all look unrelated. But taken together, they start behaving like parts of a system. And the thing that made me notice that wasn't actually the citizen wallet, it was the business wallet.
You're going straight for the obscure one. Most people are still struggling with the first wallet, and now we've got a sequel.
Exactly, and the sequel is the interesting one. A citizen wallet makes intuitive sense. You show credentials, access a service, done. A business wallet is odd, because it isn't really identifying a company. Companies already have identities. Registrars solved that years ago. It's proving whether the organization is allowed to do something right now, which is a completely different category of problem.
Or it's just digital paperwork. Instead of sending documents, you query a registry.
Well, to be honest, that's what I thought at first. But the more you follow the consequences, the less it behaves like digitized paperwork and more like removed paperwork. I mean, think about what actually happens today when a company interacts across borders. Before anything commercial happens, trust has to get rebuilt manually. So, you open an account, you send extracts, you sign a contract, you prove authority, you bid for procurement, you upload certificates. But none of that is actually business activity. It's more a legitimacy reconstruction. And every counterparty repeats it independently because they don't rely on anyone else's verification.
So, inefficiency, basically.
Yes, but it's also something structural. Because the system assumes verification can't travel. Moment one institution can rely automatically on another institution's assertion, the reconstruction disappears. And that's what the business wallet is pointing towards. Not identification, but acceptance.
You keep using that word like it means something precise.
It does. Today, the sequence is you act, and then you later prove legitimacy. But what this model implies is system checks legitimacy, only then can action exist, which sounds subtle but changes the entire flow of compliance.
You're suggesting regulation becomes preventative instead of investigative.
Yeah, maybe, but I didn't start there. What led me to it was noticing something uncomfortable. If organizations can prove authority automatically, then several technical requirements appear immediately. You need to know the entity exists. You need to know authority is valid at that moment. You need responsibility if it's wrong. You need decisions to happen automatically. And you need nobody privately controlling participation. If you like, that's pretty much like our trust stack. And that list matches the regulations everyone thinks are separate.
So, identity, cryptography, security, AI governance, interoperability.
If you start mapping them, they stop looking like policy topics and start looking like operational constraints. That's what made me wonder if Europe isn't really regulating technologies. What they're doing is defining conditions under which institutions can trust each other automatically.
That's a very generous interpretation of bureaucracy.
Possibly, but the business wallet forces this interpretation because a citizen wallet can exist inside a platform and a business wallet can't. Organizations interact across jurisdictions, regulators, banks, and supply chains, and no single operator can mediate that. So instead of trusting an intermediary, you standardize trusting verification, and that means that trust moves from relationship to protocol.
That sounds elegant until reality gets involved. Give me an example where this would actually feel different day to day.
Okay, how about bank onboarding? Today, it's essentially a forensic exercise, collecting documents to establish authority. In a machine-verifiable model, the bank would query authoritative sources directly. So a registry would confirm incorporation, and credentials would confirm representation rights. The human's no longer reconstructing legitimacy, it's just handling anomalies.
So, fewer analysts staring at PDFs.
Yes, but more importantly, legitimacy becomes binary at the point of interaction. Either the authority exists or the transaction cannot form.
That sounds brutal in procurement.
Maybe. A procurement portal wouldn't review eligibility after submission. It would check eligibility before submission. So if the credentials aren't valid, you wouldn't submit, which means compliance stops being a review stage and becomes an entry condition.
You're describing a system where administration moves into the infrastructure layer.
Well, that's pretty much the idea that we keep circling. And for instance, once you accept that possibility, then the rest of the stack suddenly makes much more sense. So identity establishes participation, cryptography anchors time, and security assigns responsibility, and automation executes decisions, and portability prevents capture. So each law stops being a domain and becomes a dependency.
You're basically arguing Europe is designing institutional interoperability rather than digital services.
Maybe. And the business wallet is the clue, because it only works if institutional decisions can travel automatically. Without that, it's just a fancy credential viewer.
All right. Let's assume, just for argument's sake, that you're right, and this is about institutional interoperability. Why should the companies listening to this care? Most of them aren't writing EU policy. They're making secure elements, running PKIs, building HSMs, doing licensing, trust services. Where's the practical impact?
Well, that's exactly where it gets interesting. Because if this becomes real, or even a little bit real, the companies in those spaces stop being adjacent to regulation, they become structural. For instance, take hardware security first. Okay, historically, secure elements and smart cards anchored identity for individuals in passports or EIDs or access credentials or whatever. But if organizational authority becomes something that has to be tamper-resistant, long-lived, and provable across jurisdictions, then secure hardware stops being authentication infrastructure and it starts to become the root of institutional authority.
You're saying the factory becomes part of the legal chain.
Well, I guess I am in a way. If a corporate signing key is injected into a secure element during manufacturing, then we have to assume that injection process becomes part of the evidentiary trail. So who provisions it, under what controls? But that's no longer just production quality. That could be considered legal defensibility. And once something becomes legally consequential, buyers change.
Change how?
Well, the buyer stops being IT security who wants fewer breaches, and now the buyer becomes the risk owner who wants defensible authority. And that's a completely different budget conversation.
So you're reframing secure hardware as institutional infrastructure. That's a big repositioning.
It is, but look at the direction of travel. If organizations present machine-verifiable credentials, and those credentials rely on materials and key materials, and those keys rely on hardware-backed custody, you can't say the hardware's peripheral, it becomes foundational.
All right, let's move to HSM vendors. They already claim to be foundational.
Well, they do, but usually in the we protect your keys sense. For a runtime model, HSM protects something more specific, legal time. If a dispute happens years later, procurement challenge, contract enforcement, regulatory audit, the question becomes, was this authority valid at the timestamp? And the integrity of that answer depends on key custody and timestamp integrity. And that is what we call evidentiary continuity, not just protection.
So instead of we stop breaches, it's we preserve enforceability.
Yes, exactly. But it's that subtle shift that moves HSMs from IT security line items to risk mitigation assets. And that's not marketing spin, that is a completely different risk category.
Let's talk trust service providers, because they're already living in this regulated world.
Yes, and they're closer to this than most people realize. Qualified electronic seals, qualified timestamps, and remote signing services. In a business wallet ecosystem, those aren't document conveniences, they're the actual mechanism by which organizational authority travels. If your timestamp anchors when a mandate was valid, then you're not just proving a file existed, you're proving enforceability, which means trust service providers shift from document workflow enablers to transaction enablers, and that's a completely different revenue story.
And pricing shifts with that.
Well, it has to. If your service determines whether a transaction may legally occur, then your value scales with transaction volume. So seat-based software as a service or SaaS pricing looks odd when your product is effectively an economic rail.
You're basically saying vendors need to stop thinking like SaaS companies.
Well, I would argue, yes, they need to think like infrastructure providers. An infrastructure has different expectations, uptime, audibility, cross-border recognition, and so forth.
What about licensing vendors? You've hinted at them a few times.
Well, they're fascinating in this context. Software licensing has always been about runtime permission. You check entitlement before execution, which means the business wallet is entitlement at an institutional scale, a credential that says this organization may perform this regulated act. And revocation means denial of execution, so that's pure licensing logic. Licensing vendors understand runtime enforcement better than most policymakers. If they reposition correctly, they're not selling DRM, they're selling institutional permission control.
Or they're selling dongles and hoping nobody notices.
It's always an option, but to be honest, I really doubt it.
All right, let's push this further. If eligibility becomes machine verifiable, what happens in procurement?
Well, procurement becomes brutally binary. Today's companies submit documents and hope the review process goes smoothly. In a business model wallet, eligibility credentials are checked before submission. And if they're invalid or revoked or expired, you simply can't submit, which means compliance becomes an entry condition, not a review stage. And that creates competitive asymmetry.
Because companies that adopt faster enter markets faster.
Exactly. Interoperability becomes a competitive advantage. And not because it's fashionable, because it moves friction. And friction in procurement is expensive.
Let's talk AI. Because if automation is evaluating authority, AI inevitably appears.
Yep, and that's where things get uncomfortable. In this model, AI isn't recommending, it's actually executing delegated authority. So it's approving eligibility, or it's rejecting compliance, or it's activating licenses. And so fundamentally, it's not decision support, it's kind of an administrative action. which means AI vendors inherit responsibility for that, and auditability becomes mandatory, and logs matter most or matter more than model size.
So the pitch shifts from intelligent to defensible.
Precisely. And defensibility is a different product conversation.
You're basically describing a world where compliance moves from audit to infrastructure.
That's exactly what I'm describing. Today you act and later prove you're allowed. In a runtime model, you prove first and only then can you act. And that's not lighter regulation, it's embedded regulation.
I can see the structural logic. I'm still not sure it's as coherent in practice as you're suggesting. Member states implement unevenly. Systems break. Political priorities shift.
All true. But I would argue that even partial adoption changes incentives. If some jurisdictions enable frictionless corporate participation and others don't, activity gravitates. Vendors who enable that frictionless layer becomes economically relevant very, very quickly.
So your argument isn't that Brussels is perfectly coherent. It's that the direction of travel is coherent enough to matter.
Yes, exactly. And the business wallet is the signal because it forces all the other layers to interlock. Without institutional capacity becoming machine verifiable, the rest are simply policy debates. With it, they become real infrastructure.
All right, let me try to summarize where we are before you escalate this into constitutional theory. You're saying the business wallet isn't about convenience. It's about making organizational authority verifiable at machine speed. And once that happens, identity, cryptography, security, automation, and portability stop being separate topics and start behaving like dependencies. That's your core claim.
Yes, and the reason I keep pushing it is because it changes how we think about compliance. Right now, compliance is mostly retrospective. You do the thing and then later someone checks if you were allowed to do the thing. If this model works the way it's been designed, then that sequence flips. The system will check if you're allowed, and only then does the thing exist. And that's not digitized paperwork, that is, well, what we call pre-transaction validation.
Which sounds suspiciously like the system decides. And that's where people get nervous.
Well, they should get nervous, because once authority becomes machine verifiable, decisions become automatable. If eligible is a query, it can be evaluated automatically, and if mandates are credentials, they can be validated instantly. If you look at licenses as status objects, they can be checked at runtime, and once runtime validation becomes normal, the actual role of humans shifts. Humans move from decision makers to exception handlers.
Which makes it sound like bureaucracy doesn't shrink, it just hides.
It doesn't shrink, it just moves to earlier in the process. Regulation becomes embedded rather than implied, and instead of reviewing activity after it happens, it defines the conditions under which activity can happen, and that is structural change.
Let me push this further. Isn't this just what good system design does anyway? Why elevate it to runtime society?
Because what's being encoded isn't product logic, it's legal capacity, and there's a difference between does this API call succeed and does this organization have the authority to bind itself legally right now? When the second question becomes machine-evaluable, law and software stop being separate layers. They start to interlock, and that's new territory for many markets.
So we're not just talking about smoother procurement or faster onboarding. We're talking about the environment in which transactions form.
Exactly. If two companies that have never interacted before can safely transact because authority, time, and responsibility are pre-verified, then that trust becomes environmental. You don't negotiate it, you just rely upon it, and that's a completely different economic baseline.
And you think vendors underestimate this?
Massively. Because most vendors still describe themselves as by technology category. We're a HMS vendor, we do PKI, we're licensing, we're a secure element manufacturer. But if this architecture stabilizes, those categories matter less than the function you provide inside institutional trust. Are you enabling participation or anchoring time or giving responsibility or executing authority? And if you can't answer that clearly, you're a feature, not an infrastructure.
That's a slightly brutal way of putting it.
Oh, come on. Markets are brutal. If your output cannot be relied upon automatically by other institutions, you can create friction. Friction loses bids. And that's why I keep coming back to competitive asymmetry. Imagine two vendors bidding for a regulated contract. One could present machine-verifiable organizational credentials, and the other just submits PDFs. Which one feels lower risk to the procurement officer?
The one that doesn't make the compliance team sweat.
My thoughts exactly. And that's how compliance becomes competitive advantage. It's not because regulation's sexy, it's because friction is really, really expensive today.
Let's talk about something you've been circling but not fully addressing. Power. If authority becomes encoded and verifiable through common protocols, whoever defines those protocols has enormous influence.
Yeah, that's true. And protocols design is political. But here's the difference between this model and platform dominance. Platforms centralize trust inside one specific operator. This model attempts to standardize trust conditions across many operators, so it's pluralistic, not singular. It might be messier, slower, but it's structurally different.
You're assuming it stays pluralistic.
Well, that's a fair point, but it depends on governance. But the intent is clearly not one platform to rule them all. It's many issuers, common recognition rules. And it's closer to how passports work than how app stores work.
So your underlying argument is less about technology and more about institutional design.
Well, yes, we digitize individuals first, and now we're digitizing institutions. And that's more complex because institutions carry liability, power, enforcement, and economic consequence. The business wallet is the clearest sign that we are crossing that line.
I'll admit something. When you first said operating system for institutions, I rolled my eyes. It sounded like a conference slide. But framing it as legal capacity becoming a credential, that lands differently. Because once authority is encoded, the rest of the stack becomes necessary.
I guess you could say that's the turning point. Without machine-verifiable authority, identity remains a convenience layer. With it, identity becomes an economic gate.
And that's why you think this isn't just policy noise.
Exactly, that's true. Because the business wallet forces the question, can institutions rely on each other's decision at machine speed? If the answer becomes yes, then the environment in which markets operate changes. So not dramatically overnight, but structurally.
Let me try one final summary, and you can correct me if I've misunderstood. What looks like a growing list of digital regulations is, viewed differently, a layered architecture. Identity determines who may participate. Cryptography anchors when something legally counts. Security assigns responsibility if something goes wrong. Automation allows decisions to execute at scale. Portability prevents any one actor from owning the gate. The business wallet matters because it turns organizations themselves into machine-verifiable actors. Legal capacity becomes a credential. Authority becomes queryable. Compliance becomes preventative. For vendors in secure hardware, trust services, PKI, HSMs, licensing, AI, and identity, this isn't abstract. It changes what you sell, who buys it, and how quickly your customers can operate. It moves compliance from paperwork to infrastructure. It shifts trust from relationship to protocol. And if it works, it creates a market where legitimacy exists at the moment of interaction, not as a document you produce afterwards. That's not just digital administration. It's a programmable institutional economy.
Well, that's exactly it. And here's the uncomfortable part for vendors today. If they're not building for recognizable machine-verifiable authority, they're building something that any future economy will have to work around. We know for a fact that markets will not reward companies they have to work around. Before we wrap up, one small practical note. If you're listening to this and thinking, well, that's quite a lot of moving parts you've covered there, Steve. You've covered identity, cryptography, interoperability, security frameworks, AI governance. Well, I'll be honest with you, you're not wrong. One of the things we've been trying to do at the quantum space recently is to try and map how these European regulations actually fit together. Because when you see them listed individually, they look like separate policy initiatives. It's only when you step back and you place them into what we call our trust stack, you start to see a pattern appear. Identity defines participation, cryptography anchors time, security assigns responsibility, automation executes decisions, and interoperability allows institutions to rely on each other. Now, if that framework is useful, we've put a short reference piece on the TQS site that lays out those layers visually. So if you want to explore the structure behind the conversation we had today, you can find it there. Just head on over to thequantumspace.org and look for the article on Europe's trust stack in the resource section. And as always, if you're working in any of these areas, identity, secure hardware, trust services, licensing, compliance infrastructure, we would genuinely like to hear how this shift looks from your side of the industry. Because the interesting part of this story isn't just policy, it's how tomorrow's markets are going to adapt to it. So all that's left for me to do now is to thank my co-host, Anna Keller, for joining me today.
Thanks, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
And to thank you guys for listening. We hope you'll join us next week on the Quantum Space Innovating Trust. Thank you. This was Innovating Trust, a Quantum Space podcast edited and produced by Crown Communications.